It's a great pleasure to welcome a really amazing group of women who are going to be talking about something that we have yet to deal with in either my podcast, incidentally, or the Awareness Day specifically, in any sort of detail. And that's the topic of sex education as it relates to sibling sexual abuse. What I call formal sex education in the school system and informal sex education that young people get for themselves, whether it's from television, their friends, reading things, the internet, whatever. So I'm really excited to be joined by these women today. So I'm going to give them a moment just to quickly introduce themselves, and then we're going to jump in. So, Sophie, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, thank you. So my name's Dr. Sophie King-Hill. I'm an associate professor at the University of Birmingham in the UK. My research centres around the sexual behaviours of children and young people. And before I was an academic, so I've been an academic for about 10 years. Prior to that, I worked in the charity sector, educating children and young people on relationships and sex.
Great. Thank you, Sophie. Stacy.
Hello, my name is Stacy Serrano. I'm a licensed clinical social worker here in California. I am a trauma-informed clinician, and I also am a school social worker.
Great. Thank you very much, Stacy. Diane.
My name is Diane Tarantini, and I come to you from West Virginia. I am a survivor of sibling sexual abuse, and I'm now a body safety educator in public schools. In addition, I write and speak on the topic of child safety to grown-ups and children alike.
That's great. Thank you, Diane. And Cami.
Hi, my name is Cami Kotler, and I'm a K-12 educator, teacher, and then principal and school founder, and the person in my organization who's been tasked with implementing comprehensive sexual health education.
That's great. Thank you. And as I said off camera, what a great group of women to be talking about this subject. And I appreciate your time today. So I'm going to just throw us all in the deep end here and say that one of the questions I'm often asked by people who are just beginning to learn about sibling sexual abuse is the question, why isn't sibling sexual abuse mentioned in sex education in schools, particularly if it is quote unquote such a big deal? So I'm just going to throw that question out there, but I am going to start with you, Sophie.
So I think, so thanks, Nancy. And I think it's a really good question. It's really valid. I think we need to take a step back before we even think about why isn't sibling sexual abuse and behaviour talked about within the curriculum. We've got to look at the curriculum. Is it fit for purpose? Are developmentally appropriate sexual behaviours talked about adequately to children and young people? And in the main, no, they're not. So what then happens is, if developmentally appropriate sexual behaviours are seen as taboo or are seen as a really contentious issue to talk to young people about, where does that leave child sexual abuse, but also specifically sibling sexual behaviours? Because again, when we looked at the research, it seems like it's the last taboo because it exists within a family system. There's a lot of shame involved in that, but also, we find it hard to talk about developmentally appropriate sexual behaviours with young people without shame anyway. So that's where it becomes problematic. It's where we see this disparity with talking to young people about sex, and we see the two as mutually exclusive. So that's an additional barrier we've got to get past before we can even start tackling these really important issues.
And how do we get past that, though?
I think having conversations like these, recognising that parents are concerned about relationships and sex education, and having the conversations with them to reassure them that actually all the research tells us that the earlier we educate our children on relationships and sex, the more likely they are to delay their first sexual experiences, but also they'll know that they've got safe spaces to come to talk about things that they think that are happening to them that aren't appropriate.
And Cami, in your role in implementing or being tasked with, encouraging parents to engage with sex education in schools, to give the green light for these things to be going on, what's your experience of it, sort of what Sophie's talking about in terms of the relationship the schools have with parents generally?
I think, I think it's interesting that California, which has maybe one of the strongest laws around sexual health education in K-12, and with the the California Healthy Youth Act has like a laundry list of things that we are required to teach students at least once in middle school and at least once in high school. And it's very detailed, but it does not mention sibling sexual abuse. It is a wonderful opportunity to teach consent. And I think consent is something that that parents can agree on, right? And something that they don't automatically teach their children. So to me, the sort of thin end of the wedge is teaching consent, really explicitly teaching all aspects of consent and teaching it over and over and over again. And then also getting parents on board with teaching it to their children. It's a massive cultural shift, right? Because we tend to treat our children's bodies like, we change their diapers. It's almost like they're ours, right? But getting to that place where we really equip our children to know that they have a right to say no to things.
And not only the right, but they have the voice. But sometimes the environment isn't conducive to that voice, right? So that's where I'm sure, Diane, you create resources that you present in a way that is almost child-ready material, isn't it, right? It's written for children to understand body safety and things like that.
Yes, so Aaron's Law has been passed in 38 states in the United States, but it basically is body safety. So it's telling kids what's okay and what's not okay, and it's telling them how to use their voice. But the sex ed component of the conversation doesn't enter into what we do in a body safety assembly, unfortunately. I'm not even sure sex ed is being taught in my state for the reasons mentioned. People want to think young people are not doing these things or thinking about these things or looking at these things when in truth they are.
And they're also sexual beings. I mean,
Absolutely.
It's not like all of a sudden you hit 18 and you go, oh, cool, sex. Like it's not anything like that, right? So I wonder, Stacey, in your experience in the work that you do with kids, to what extent do you see this sort of gap in awareness or gap of knowledge when it comes to what children and specifically and families generally do and do not understand about even the topic of sex education or sex?
I think that they do understand. I think it's just there's so much shame around it. It's such a taboo topic. Especially I predominantly work with Latino families. It's just something that you do not talk about, right? And so it's definitely something that even though they are aware of it, it's very early on. It's like, no, you don't do that, right? Immediately it's no, you do not touch down there, right? And it's like having these conversations with explaining to them like, okay, what is down there, right? Like letting them know that down there is a part of their body, right? And so naming it appropriately. And it's definitely a cultural shift that you have to do. Definitely something that you have to literally work with families. And I've worked with 0 to 5 families as well as a clinician. And early on, it is talking about like, okay, this is their body and naming those body parts, right? Talking about consent. And so it's definitely something that they are aware of, but that's just something we don't talk about. Like, well, no, it's very uncomfortable. And it's how do you foster relationships with the families that you work with, right? So for example, like in the school setting, like how close can I get to this family that we can have these very uncomfortable conversations that can lead us to have like an impact in allowing us as a school to, provide these resources or services for your family. And so it starts there because it's there and they're aware of it, but it's just so taboo that we just don't have a conversation around it. And so even when you are having like 0 to 5 like therapy sessions, or when you are now in the middle of like some sexual abuse has happened within the family, there's so much shame and so much guilt around it. And then the more you talk to these parents, the more that they're like, well, I went through that and I just did everything possible, right? So it wouldn't happen to my child. But everything possible is literally shielding them from the possibility of this even happening. And so it's, how do I foster a good enough relationship where I am coming to you in a very empathetic way of understanding, but this is the reality, and how do we address it now, and how do we teach consent? And it starts off very, very small. Like in a lot of Latino families, or families of color, you really do sit there and, like, you have to give a kiss, like you have to say hello, you have to hug. And so it's how do we start that conversation with, the minute that you start allowing, like, pushing that agenda, you start confusing the child into, like, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, how far can they go, how far can, when is it okay for me to stop it? And so the conversation starts at home with the families at an early age. And so it just, that's the fundamentals of it. Like, how do we start there? But definitely it's there. It's just so taboo that it's, how am I able to foster a relationship that we can talk about this, and, eliminating that shame and that guilt, because it's not that they are not keeping their children safe or that they're not doing what they're supposed to do, right? It's just, there's so many other things happening around that it's important to talk about. But I think culturally, like as a society, we have just deemed this as something like irrelevant or not important, or no, we don't talk about this. They do it at home whenever they choose to, right? But then at home, they're also trying to shield them the best way that they can, which is by just not talking about it. And so then that like creates the circle, right? That we never ending circle and cycle of abuse and just a confusion for these children.
And also that sort of ongoing debate, because I remember when I was a kid, in the 1960s, yes, I just dated myself, and the 1970s, it's like, whose responsibility is it to teach children? And we have that debate because you have, as you were saying, parents who are very uncomfortable, or culturally this is not spoken about. And then you have the school system, which has a way that they need to do certain things. And, and Cami, we've talked about that before in terms of those things that can get in the way of a school being able to deliver the education in terms of, rules that you have to follow. And then the teachers having to deal with things because something is being taught in school, whether it's SSA or other forms of CSA. So can we sort of talk about that in terms of that sort of, I call it a slinky back and forth, that thing that you hold in your hand about who's responsible, what do we teach, back and forth like this. So Cami, can we dive into that a little bit more about the problems that are faced in not only creating the curriculum, but then expecting teachers who are already burdened with a lot of stuff to provide that information in a school setting?
I mean, I think the school is sort of beautifully positioned to be the place where medically accurate, factual information is taught about a subject that's really fraught and that people have a lot of feelings about, right? The challenge in schools is all mandates fall upon schools, right? We're responsible for scoliosis checks, and we're responsible for measles shots. And so anytime there's any sort of social ill, it's easy for the legislature to say the schools will do it. And when they add those mandates, they don't typically add any additional resources, right? They just add things to our list of things to do. So it's always challenging in the K-12 setting to make it all happen, just physically. And then I think the other aspect is who should teach comprehensive sexual ed. And it really ought to be somebody who really wants to teach comprehensive sexual ed. And I see so often in schools, there's this kind of default, or the PE teacher is in charge of it. Well, is the football coach the best person to teach it? Maybe, maybe not. So I think identifying somebody who wants to do it and then giving them appropriate training so they're equipped to do it. And then, as Stacy said, building the trust with families and having a policy that facilitates sexual education happening. And in California, it's a passive consent system. By law, we have to notify parents 2 weeks ahead of time, at least 2 weeks ahead of time. By law, they have to have access to all the materials, but they can't, but we don't ask them for permission, we inform them. And then if parents don't want to participate, they have to contact the school formally and request for their child not to participate, which then is this perfect moment for the school to step in and find out, hey, what are your concerns? And the line I always use as a principal is, you recognize all their peers are taking these classes. So it's going to be discussed immediately afterwards on the playground. Trust me, it's going to be discussed immediately afterward on the playground. So your child's going to hear about it. Your decision is, do you want them to hear about it secondhand through their peers, or do you want to them to hear about it firsthand through a trained adult?
And Sophie, in the UK, there are some similar structures around education, is there not?
Yeah, it's a really fraught landscape at the moment, and it's highly politicised and is being weaponised by the government, relationships and sex education. So, you know, we're watching it unfold, and it's really putting schools in a really cautious position. They're really careful now about how they talk to young people about relationships and sex. But if we bring it back to the point about whether it's a school's responsibility or parents' responsibility, we've got to recognise all these converging factors within society that fosters shame around talking about consensual sex between adults. I mean, you've got to look at all the people in the city of New York. They all exist because people had sex, but nobody talks about it. You know, it's like there's this huge taboo around sex, around sexual pleasure, and around consenting sexual practices. So people don't talk about them anyway. So we can't suddenly then say to parents and teachers, okay, you've got to teach this now, and you've got to teach sibling sexual behaviours and abuse. You've got to teach child sexual abuse, and you've got to teach sexual pleasure, and you've got to not feel shame when you talk about that. It's unrealistic to say, right, suddenly stop feeling shame, everybody talk about sex. It's not going to work like that. You know, we can talk about it because we work in the field, and you build up that kind of desensitization. However, you can't just land that on a parent, and you can't, as Cami said, just put it on the big PE teacher, because time and time again in my research, young people are telling us, yes, we want a safe space to talk about this. We want the facts, but also if the educator is making us cringe and they're embarrassed, nobody learns, and we all just want to crawl under the desk. And this is talking about developmentally appropriate sexual behaviours, not sibling sexual behaviours. So we've got to get to the point where we can talk about what's developmentally appropriate around consent, around taking the shame out of it, around sexual pleasure, before we can even get to that point. But we can't just suddenly land it on parents, carers or teachers. What we've got to do is say, as was reflected in what Cami was saying, is say the right people in the right place. And the safe space might be at home with your parents to talk about this. You might be really open as a parent, or it might be in a school setting. You know, it might be with the PE teacher, or it might be with the head teacher or principal. But the key thing is the safe space where they can come and talk about these issues. They can come and talk about things that are bothering them. They can come and talk about things where they don't think consent took place, because we know consent isn't very clear in terms of, do you want to do this? I said no, so it wasn't consensual. It's more, it's really complex, it's nuanced. And, you know, there's a feeling within a person, because when somebody's being coerced into doing something they don't want to do, you know, the person doing the coercing isn't going to say, do you want to consent to this or not? There's a whole lot of grooming around it, a lot of coercion. But what we need to be talking to the children and young people about is, did something feel not right? Was something uncomfortable? Did you, you know, you were convinced that it was okay, but actually it didn't feel okay. They need the safe space to come to unpick this with somebody. And that comes from really early good relationships and sex education, which creates that space from which takes the shame out of it, where they can come along and say, look, this happened with my sibling. I need to talk to somebody about it. I need to unpick it, because I don't think it was consensual, even though it was implied it was consensual. You know, so it's really conflicting. But the key thing here is the safe space. But we can't just land that on schools, as Cami said, but we can't just land it on parents and carers. It's got to be we've got to understand that there's so much shame around sex anyway, that it's got to be the right people to have these conversations.
Yeah, and I guess, Diane, that sort of brings me to you, because I wonder, you know, more and more people are sort of making services available, such as yourself. You go as an external provider into a school system or into a classroom or whatever, and as this sort of person coming in, you then do body safety classes and things like that, right? You provide this information, and perhaps that's part of the solution mix as well, as it were, because I know I grew up in a Catholic school, I would have been really well, I was uncomfortable when we had sex education. It was not great. But had the math teacher been also doing sex education, I would have had a hard time sitting through math class after listening to certain things, right? So do you think that perhaps somehow external people coming into a school system, not so much family, but into the school system, is that part of a potential solution going forward?
I think it absolutely is. When you have people with a dedicated like PowerPoint presentation and we're touching on body safety, internet safety, sextortion, the bathing suit body rules, and we do it dynamically and we engage the kids. It's going to be I believe it's going to be better received than if it is the homeroom teacher or a pamphlet. I would love, in a perfect world, I would love to see like a blending of the body safety and the sexual education component. I would love to see, even if we had at the end of our body safety assemblies, if we had the time for a Q&A, but because schools are so pressed to present the curriculum and all of the suicide prevention and diversity and inclusion and don't do drug workshops, there's just such a limited time that we're in front of these kids. But what's so important to me with a body safety assembly is these children have to know this set of behaviors is acceptable morally, and this is not. Because if a child is being harmed in their family environment, those adults or people around them have built that world, and they've determined what's right and what's wrong and what's normal and what's not normal. So that's why I love doing what I do, because I can stand up in front of people and say, at least 30% of abusers are family members. And just this year, just last month, I committed to start talking about the topic of sibling sexual abuse. So here I am, like in 3 different body safety assemblies facing 300 middle schoolers. And I tell them my abuse was familial, it was child on child. And here's a little bit of extra information you need to know. It was my older brother. I tell you what, the crowd went wild. The kids absolutely knew it was not okay. They were absolutely appalled, which was both validating and shocking. I didn't expect that big of a response, but just from the traction that the topic of sibling sexual abuse is getting, I know it's so important to talk about. If 1 in 25 kids, I don't know if I'm getting that statistic correct, 1 in 25 families is being affected. As I look out at 300 kids, I know there's 10 in the crowd. I know there are. And we often get disclosures like within a 2-week period of time. They're not going to walk in front of all their peers up to the speaker lady and disclose. But as they think about what they heard, as they gather courage, it takes courage to disclose. And hopefully those schools have set up systems where they can put a note in a box, talk to a counselor, or what have you. But that, I think, is the value of body safety assemblies, is to tell these kids what's right and wrong and let them ask questions. Because we know from research, they want to talk to adults that they know and love and trust about these topics. Because if they don't get it from us, they go to bad places for that information.
Well, let's sort of talk about that. But Cami, you have a thought?
I do. It's interesting because I have 2 thoughts. One is that one of the things that always strikes me when we do our sex ed at the middle school level, high school level also, is how quickly the students stop giggling and start submitting questions. And even though it's a topic that's fraught, if you put somebody in front of them who's modeling comfort and factualness, I don't think that's a word, but you know what I mean?
It'll pass.
They begin to ask all their pressing questions, and they have many pressing questions. You know, probably the number one thing is this normal? So they're very anxious about themselves, what they're feeling and experiencing. And then the next set of questions is typically around consent. Is it okay if someone does X with someone Y? Just all the different possible permutations of human relationships come right out. And they come out relatively quickly within 1 or 2 sessions. So I think that's really promising. Kids are going to ask questions if you give them the space and you put an adult in front of them who's comfortable. I think the other thing is that what we emphasize in California at the K-12 is that we're not teaching what's right or wrong. It's not our job to teach the values. I tell the parents, your job is to teach your values. We're going to give them factual information. You have a right to say no to things. You have a right to do X, Y, and Z. Your body these are the names of your body parts. This is how it factually works. And now it's up to you as a family. We're giving them this information. It is information. It's up to you as a family to support them and to teach your values. Because I think a lot of times the anxiety around sex ed is very much this fear that my family's values are going to be trumped or taken over or corrupted by the outside world. And I say over and over, you have them all the time, parents. You have the power to teach your values. You have the time. We're going to give them factual information to keep them safe, to keep them healthy.
I like what you said there too, because I think, one of the things that I know as a step parent, and I was introduced to my kids when they were a little bit older, but it was the factual part of the conversation that made me uncomfortable when talking to the kids. Whereas the value part and the moral part, the sort of imparting my morals and stuff and explaining to the kids who are my stepkids, but how I felt and how I grew up, was a much easier conversation for me in terms of comfort and confidence than trying explaining the facts that are related to sex education and how the body works. So it's really interesting that what you're saying there. And again, to me, it's like, well, that's kind of common sense. If the school is sort of really going into the facts, that's can be very difficult for parents, that part. But in our value conversations with our kids, we have those little micro conversations all the time about what our family feels is morally correct, or our religion, or these sorts of our culture, and all of these sorts of things, and the little micro conversations that we have around the house and around the kitchen table, or when something pops up and you have a 30-second conversation. So that's where the facts that you're teaching come with the values that I'm imparting on my kids. And Sophie, you had a comment about this?
Yeah, I think it's really important to teach them to question the values as well. If there's something that they don't agree with that's going on at home, or there's something in this kind of value base at home that doesn't sit right with them, they're allowed to question those as well. They haven't got to take those as absolute. And I think if we're talking in the context of sibling sexual behaviours and abuse, that's vitally important. As Cami said, it's really important to teach them the factual things around relationships and sex ed, but also that they're allowed to question things. They're allowed to question values that they don't think are right, or that don't sit right with them. And they're allowed to come back to the safe space that they've got and talk about this and say, the values at home, they don't feel right. There's something going on. A bit like the kind of consent thing, I don't feel like this didn't feel right, but I was convinced it was, like somebody convinced me it was. And it's teaching them that they can question values as well. Not what goes on behind closed doors is not always okay in terms of values, moral positioning. If we think about things like racism and sexism, misogyny, homophobia, anti-trans, people will frame them as values within their home that they find it makes them uneasy when people conflict with those in schools. So we also have to be teaching young people and working with them to recognise that they can question those family values as well, that they're not absolutes. And that links really strongly to highlighting, sexual behaviours that aren't appropriate that are going on in the home as well, that might be constructed that way because they sit within a wider family dysfunction.
And Diane, just before we move on to talking about what can happen when there's a gap in this education and where kids might end up going for that information, you have a comment from what Sophie was saying?
I did. One thing that we always present in our assemblies is the importance of children having safe adults beyond their parents, because like was just mentioned, if it's the parent that is presenting a value and the child is not agreeing with it, that is a really hard conversation to have. So we always talk about having safe adults, someone over 18 who they can have conversations with in the event that they don't feel comfortable with their parents. So teachers, neighbors, aunts, uncles, what have you. But we love safe adults to create
I
safe
think
spaces for hard questions. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think re-emphasizing the point about safe spaces, safe space in the school where you're getting information related to sort of the factual stuff, the sex ed, and then also the safe spaces with adults and people who have information. If somebody feels safe, and I've said this in another episode in this year's Awareness Day, when children feel safe, they are usually capable of communicating in one form or another in a way that we can hear them if we're open to hearing them. But if we're safe for a child, then we are open to hearing them. And I think they sense that. So reinforcing the idea of safety. Stacy, do you have any comments on what we've been speaking about before we move on to talking about what happens when there's a gap?
I do. There's a few. So definitely, I think the education piece is what is so important. Both educating like the school and like teachers about what safety looks like, right? And being that safety adult. As one of the safety adults like on campus, it's you see it there at my door literally all the time, right? And it's because they know that they can share what they have to share. Like they know that this person is going to fight for them or advocate for them or is going to be there for them. And so I try my hardest to let everyone on campus be that person. Not everyone feels comfortable, of course, right? But at least like you're aware, like you have the social worker there and you have the counselor there. Like who do you feel comfortable like going? There's at least two people there designated who work in this field that like know a lot more, that are able to have these conversations with you in an educational way, but also in a very empathetic way as well. But I do think that going back to what Dr. Sophie said is very important, is going like letting the kids know like not everything that's in your home is safe, right? And having that conversation with them and what that looks like, because maybe you're not able to move away. Maybe it's just, you know, you identify as queer and your family is not accepting of it, right? And it's kind of like, well, we can work together while we're here. Like, can we have family therapy sessions? Like, am I able to go ahead and, you know, refer you out, you know, to therapy? And that's the work that we have to do. So ultimately, we're working together as a community, as a school community, and then also as a family. We're all going to work together. And the end goal is that you're going to leave this place thriving in a family setting. Is that always 100% going to happen? No, but that is my goal. At least I'm going to be there to advocate for this child, and I'm going to be there to advocate for this family and try to work with them the best that I can. So when they do leave, at least I know that I tried. To help them get to a better place. A lot of it is the education piece. And I think that that's so important. And what's usually missing in schools is like, how can we start from the beginning, right? So I work in a middle school, right? So 6th to 8th grade. Since the beginning, how are we fostering these relationships once they come to our campus? How many parent meetings are we having? How many parent meetings are we having that are discussing, you know, sexting or, you know, everything that's happening right now? Because right now, what we are noticing is parents are coming to school and they're having these conversations of, oh my God, I caught my daughter or my son seeing X, Y, and Z on the internet, and it's happening. It's going to happen. And so what can we look for? And I think that's important. Having those conversations of this is going to happen. How can we work together so we can keep your child safe, right? Because their safety is important to us. And within that conversation of allowing these kids to see someone or talk to someone, myself or the counselor, come other important pieces of conversations of they disclose something to us. Okay, we're going to talk about it. And that also includes building those relationships. And that's why it just comes down to the relationship piece of it and that education piece. And how can we blend them together seamlessly? So I think it is important having outside resources coming in, not everything being in-house, but it's always having that trauma-informed lens as well. And how do we teach teachers and others about that. And I think it's gonna come from us, the experts in this field, and what we know, and how can we just bring it in so that it's widely accepted, if that makes sense. So it's the
Yeah.
advocating piece as well for legislation. But that was all that was going through my mind when I heard what Dr. Sophie King was saying. Basically, it definitely comes to the education part, and how can we bring that education by assemblies, by parent meetings, and how do we get these parents to come? Like, what are we doing to meet their needs, right? If they're working parents and they're not able to come on campus, it's literally troubleshooting to see how can we get this information out to the families and have these difficult conversations. And the experts doing it, not necessarily the gym teacher, right? Because they're not going to have the language to do it.
Yeah, and I think what I'm hearing everybody say is that, you know, building sort of a context around families and children and all of that sort of thing is, you know, sibling sexual abuse happens in a context, and it is reviewing, looking at, and improving that context, you know, that's around a child, that can help prevent and or intervene sibling sexual abuse. But one of the things that we know, and I've heard this from those who have caused harm and just researchers and all the rest of it, is that the issue of porn is becoming a very, you know, an obvious part of some aspects of sibling sexual abuse. And we could have an entire conversation just about this, and we only have a few minutes. But many children report, going back to what, you know, somebody said, I think it was you, Cami, about children being curious about what is normal. You know, and they're not getting their answers. So they're looking to media, whether that's television, soft porn, or hardcore porn that they're finding on the internet and other places. Sophie, I know you have, you know, research, and you know this in terms of porn contributing to sibling sexual abuse specifically. So what are you seeing, and what are we noticing in the research about that?
So I think the first thing we've got to acknowledge when we talk about pornography to children and young people is to not demonize it, because again, it loads it with, and that might be a controversial perspective or position to have. But if we think about it, I think there was 1 month in 2020 that Pornhub and other sites that stream hardcore pornography had more hits than eBay, Amazon, Netflix combined. You know, so we've got to think people are accessing this, and why are they accessing it? Because they enjoy watching it. Nobody, not in my 20-year career, have I ever heard anyone say, yeah, I enjoy watching porn, you know, and own it and be really without shame. So we've got to recognize that there's a lot of shame. However, it's widely accessed, and young people are accessing it, yes, for information. They're also accessing it, and they find that they're enjoying it. What we found, and so we need to have those conversations. Again, that's the safe spaces for them to say, actually, I've seen something on Pornhub and I'd like to talk about it. When can they ever say that? There's nowhere. So they have to keep it inside. They can't even go to peers a lot of the time and say, I've seen this on Pornhub, or I've seen this on a, you know, somebody sent me this pornography and I found it really disturbing. There's no avenue to have that dialogue anyway. But then when we think about sibling sexual behaviour and abuse, there's a normalisation within pornography. So there's a lot of stepsister, stepbrother pornography, like a vast amount, a huge amount. And if a young person does go onto a streaming site and likes the look of a video and clicks it, that might say stepsister, stepbrother, and they haven't realised, and the algorithm will kick in and then start feeding them that type of pornography. Or they might be looking for it to normalise behaviours or to try to find reasons for behaviours that are going on at home. So I think that when we talk about porn, it's really multidimensional. You know, we don't want them to just get all their information from pornography, but we also, as a society, don't have an open dialogue about them seeing things in pornography that they might have liked. It's highly unlikely they'd talk about that. But also in pornography, things that have upset them. There's nowhere for them to go to say, look, I watched porn, but I clicked on this and this happened and I saw this. I want to make sense of it. And, you know, what we don't recognise quite often is that young people have agency. You know, they should be leading these conversations. They're the experts in the world that they live in today, especially in relationships and sex education. And they consistently tell us in the research that I've done and other colleagues in this field is that it's too little too late. They're telling us things we already know. let us help you, let us support you, we want to learn about this. So I think that there's, like I said, it's very multidimensional, but the one key aspect that's really concerning in terms of the sibling sexual behaviour and abuse is that they seem to get away with it by putting step in front of it, which condones it, which normalizes it. And again, you know, that's an issue that we're only just starting to unpick now.
Yeah, and as you say, it's quite a complex issue. And from a, from a business point of view, pornography is not going to go away. It makes a whole truck of money. So it's unrealistic to expect it's going to go away. So it's about understanding how to support people in watching it and understanding it if they watch it. And we've said repeatedly throughout this conversation, we've used words like taboo, shame, guilt, and all of these sorts of things, which comes down to me is really the more we focus in on reducing stigma around all these different pieces and help to society to understand, hence the Awareness Day, but society to understand these things, much like, again, when I was, much younger, we didn't talk about any kind of abuse in the church. We didn't talk about abuse in sports because there was a lot of stigma around it. As the stigma went down and people started to come out with facts and information, society all of a sudden said, oh dear, we better be talking about this. My hope for running the Awareness Day and for having conversations with amazing folks like yourselves is that we're contributing to that education of society so that they can start to say, hey, maybe I actually need to take the shame that I'm pushing out into the world by having a stigma towards this. Maybe I need to continue to educate myself, engage with my school, for example, ask my school board what they're doing, what systems do they have in place. I know lots of parents who've never spoken to a member of the school board or spoken to a teacher beyond parent-teacher interviews, and all that sort of stuff. So my hope is that in the future, one of the solutions is reducing the stigma that parents, families, and society hold to these factors that are contributing to sibling sexual abuse. And I know we need to wrap up. So sort of as we go around, if anybody has a final thought or anything that you think in terms of a solution or a call to action or something that somebody can take away from this conversation or a final important message, so that now's your time. So Sophie, I saw your mic go off, so I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah, it's just a really brief point. Young people have agency. We have to accept that they have a developing sexuality, and it's not too much too soon with relationships and sex education. It's too little too late at the moment.
And I would add, as much as the instinct is to shield them, as I think Stacey described, how do we protect them? We have to recognize that they're going out into the world. And if there are 100 sixth graders and one of them has a phone with access to porn, all other 99 are going to hear the story.
Yes.
So as hard as you may work to protect your child, you have to, more than that, you have to equip them with a realistic understanding of what's actually happening in the world around them so that they're able to have that agency and that voice to do things to keep themselves safe and happy.
Great. Thank you. Stacey.
Yes, and if you are in the position to advocate, right, for these conversations to happen, to do so, like for you to be able to start building those relationships, not only with the families, but also the young people, like having these conversations and being that safe person. You just need one.
That's perfect. Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's a great comment. Diane?
Yeah, so I believe that my greatest tip for child safety is just like the relational intimacy between parent and child, starting with the first diaper change. The philosophy that no question is a dumb question, no question is an unacceptable question, and you become that child's source of if I don't have the answer, I'll find it for you. So I just say have those conversations daily on every single topic imaginable. You can even share, like, I heard this thing on the news today, and have you heard about sibling sexual abuse? Is this going on anywhere that you know about? Just nonstop conversations about all the things. They're going to make you a trustworthy, a safe adult for your child or another child, even just conversation. I often say if a child feels close to you, they may disclose to you. So that's always the goal, is just making them feel safe and loved
And even if, thank you for that, and even if something like sibling sexual abuse, which is what we're talking about, doesn't occur in one's family, building that trusting, safe relationship with your child is just great anyway, right? For all sorts of different things, not only when they're children, but as they become adults as well, and start making sense of life in their 20s and 30s and all of these sorts of things. I believe that children are, sexual beings who are quite intelligent, but they have a gap of knowledge, and they're also fundamentally curious. So one way or another, they're going to find their answers. And the ideal is that they're finding good, positive answers that, as you say, Sophie, help them to have that agency for themselves. So, ladies, I want to thank you for your time today. I know we need to wrap up. It's been a joy, and we could dissect these little things and have entire conversations about small things that we mentioned, but I really appreciate that you're generously sharing your wisdom and expertise, and helping people in the audience of the Awareness Day to understand this topic a little bit more. So thank you very much for that. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Nancy.